the ministers just walk down the aisle. And maybe Daniel, you're going to be the minister tonight, because it got very quiet when you entered. Reverend, sorry. This is Brother Reverend. Actually, before that. It doesn't matter. You can take your pick. Take a vote. Very nice. This is
If I may make a suggestion, I can't remember exactly what point size a lot of this PowerPoint is, but I'm not sure my vision, I don't think I would be able to read it from the back. If you want to move forward, you may be more comfortable, this may be more effective, I don't know.
You want to flip a few?
Sure.
Slides.
So that slide right there, can you see that from the back? I guess you probably can. I guess you're all right. It's up to you.
Bonsoir, Sunil. We've got amplification tonight. So we thought everyone's situated. We'll introduce our speaker.
Though speaking of amplification, I'm going to not use that unless I have to. You can hear me okay at this volume, right?
Yeah.
Good.
When we go to questions and answers, we have this so we can pick you up. Actually, you're picking everyone up on your recording device.
Okay.
So I have a question for everyone. Good evening. Before the question, I'm Enrique Kreuter, which sounds like a lot of nationalities in one name, and it is. I wasn't happy being a German-American from New Jersey, so I started going to Spain in 1997, and I said, why not call myself Enrique? A little bit more salsa in my step. So I have been enjoying doing and running and helping find speakers for Community Planet /Savvy Investors for about 3 years. And tonight, I would have to say, was the most clockwork formation of people coming, speaker coming, helping me out. And we don't have an audio-visual person except me today and our speaker, Craig. So everything worked and people came in and we had Peter on the sign-in. So I would say in 3 years, this is clicking along the best ever. So I'm very, very pleased. Thank you all for helping me with that. The question I have for anyone who would care to raise a hand is how did the United States and most of the world pull out of the Great Depression?
World War II.
World War II. And some countries were still going through the Industrial Revolution, right? England started in 1760, America after that, and then the rest of the world that had influence from these two superpowers started their Industrial Revolution, and the war ramped that up in a mechanized way. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get out of the 2008 and beyond Great Recession that they call it without a war, unless it's a green war, a green insurrection, where we refuse to do things in a modality that may not be sustainable. How many people would be happy if, like Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, it would last for 1,000 years? How many people would like to have a house that would last for 200 years without having to knock down everything and replace everything that the termites have been eating? I imagine there are ways to do that. Craig, you read on that, so maybe you can share a little bit on that later during your presentation. But I've gotten a lot of calls on this subject, so I'm guessing it's a hot subject for many. And they asked us for more information, so we're recording tonight, and we're going to try to put the information, if it turns out okay, on film, on the internet, so other people can take a look at what Craig shared and some of your questions tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up our speaker, Craig Shields.
Thanks very much. Thank you, my friend.
Turned on?
Yes, we're ready to go. And I should say in advance that this is going to be a kind of a limited presentation in many senses. One, I'll be doing no dancing. I did volunteer to do this, though I'm not, I don't consider myself, Winston Churchill or, God's gift to the public speaking world. Though I do think you'll find this subject interesting, which is why I've decided I wanted to make this talk tonight. As it turns out, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century said, life is either a thrilling adventure or it's nothing at all. And God, I love that. And I love it so much that I'd like to kind of put this talk and my life's work in the context of a thrilling adventure. What I am about to talk about is the concept that our population here, 7 billion people on this planet right now, soon to become 10 billion, our population is in the process of quintupling in 100 years. From 1950 to 2050, it'll go from 2 billion to 10 billion people. And most of us, I think, in this room, because I've met some of you before, would agree there are issues with respect to this, with respect to the consumption of natural resources, with respect to the generation of pollution, with respect to how we're getting along in an environment with increasingly scarce stuff, and what we're doing to our planet and one another in the process. So this makes, if this isn't a thrilling adventure to figure this out, I don't know what is. So what I would like to do is just talk to you a little bit about what I've learned over the last couple of years. One of which, by the way, the reason for this slide is I write a book a year on the subject of renewable energy and the larger context of sustainability. And I do that not because I'm smart, but because I'm smart enough to know that I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, and that I need to get in front of subject matter experts. So each of these is a compilation of interviews that I've conducted with people in various aspects of, maybe it's a technology, maybe it's an economic issue, maybe it's a political issue, and in fact, I like to just represent myself as somebody who does, I hit the road a couple of years ago and to conduct interviews with everybody and his dog. That happens to be my dog, but it could be anyone's. But my point is that I want to, I was a physics major as an undergraduate. I emphasize undergraduate. I'm not a professor, a professional physicist. I was also a graduate student in philosophy, but I'm not a philosophy professor. Or a professional philosopher, whatever that could possibly mean. Having said that, I can speak a little bit about this on a wide range of subjects, enough to ask good questions of smart people, and that's why I've come to these, I wouldn't say conclusions, but situations where I think we have something to talk about in terms of who's going to win here. So, for instance, when I say this is a thrilling adventure, I don't think that there's a foregone conclusion that the human species and the other, zillions of life forms on this planet are in fact going to survive what we are in the process of doing. I'm not asserting that we're doomed for failure. As a matter of fact, people say, well, you're a pessimist. I go, no. A pessimist is somebody who's decided this isn't going to work. I don't know whether it's going to work or not. I guess I'm not an optimist either for that reason. I guess you could say I'm a meliorist. I'm somebody who understands that if somebody, in particular, if a large number of people aren't trying to make things better, we're in a world of hurt. So anyway, enough on that. Here's one way of looking at this. The concept of who we are as a species. Our species is, depending on whom you ask, between 100,000 to 200,000 years old. It has evolved from, as I say, hunter-gatherers, but it's also evolved not to make changes. There is no precedent for 7 billion people or even 70,000 people coming together and say, what we're doing here is fundamentally unsustainable and we have to make a change. We haven't done that in the last couple 100,000 years. So there's no reason for me to stand here in front of you this evening and say, this is going to work. We're going to find it in our DNA to do something that may not exist in our DNA. Certainly we're evolved as cooperative beings. So I don't know, again, this anthropology is certainly not my long suit, but it does, from what I've learned on this thing, it is certainly our nature to cooperate with one another. Nurturing is essential to our development. If you take babies that aren't held, that aren't kept warm, that aren't shown love, they wither and die and they get disease and that's it. So there's very definitely a connection between the way we comport ourselves with one another and the way we in fact survive. Having said that, our society does not necessarily support this warmth and this cooperation. I'm reminded of the maxim of, I guess you could call it the maxim of capitalism, though I don't know that it pertains specifically to capitalism, but let us ignore the needs of others. In other words, one takes care of oneself and one's family. So at the very minimum, this competitive society generates problems, including what I write here about ignorance, war, hatred, etc. And though there are rare situations where small groups of people have figured out how to get along and live together quite comfortably, as a matter of fact, criminals from various parts of Europe are often, instead of sent to prison, they're sent to work on kibbutzes in Israel, simply because the judges go, I don't know what's the matter with this guy, I don't know what to do for this guy, maybe he can figure out how to get along with other people. Now, okay, so as I say, population's quintupling, that's bad news, but here's the other issue on this thing. Enrique was talking before I stood up about the history of the last couple hundred years and the Industrial Revolution and so forth. It wasn't that long ago that the work, in other words, the energy that is consumed endosomatically into the body, which for an average adult American is about 2,000 calories, and the work put off, in other words, if we wanted something done, we wanted a house built, we wanted to go to the market, we wanted to, harvest our tomatoes, the work associated with getting that done came specifically, you're all familiar with the conservation of energy. It doesn't come, you don't, put 2 calories in and get 4 calories out. That work came from us. Now, yes, a few thousand years ago, we figured out how to domesticate, horses and so forth. So to a degree, that 2,000 calories is multiplied by a couple in the form of barnyard animals. But it's been very recent in human history that 2,000 calories has gone through the roof. Does anybody want to take a shot at how many calories per day the average adult human consumes, including not only the 2,000 he's ingesting, but the rest of his computers and cars and skyrockets and so forth and so on?
500,000.
That's the right order of magnitude. It's 230,000. So it's 111 times more than we consume. So we take largely fossil fuels. We take stuff that nature has left around for us, which we discovered fairly recently, and we just burn that as quickly and as selfishly as we possibly can. When I say, I'm sorry?
We should eat more.
Right, exactly. If we could become, Astro Man, I suppose there would be a case for that. But my point on this thing is that when you talk about lack of sustainability, the concept that there are soon to become 10 billion people, and per capita, we're going to be consuming far more energy than we were before. We're constantly consuming more energy. We have huge urbanizing populations, especially in Asia, that want to live the same way Americans and Canadians and the British and the Europeans do, and especially Americans and Canadians with our fantastic consumption of energy. So that's an issue. That is, when you talk about lack of sustainability, you normally think of the connotation. You say, oh, sustainability is cool, it's green, it's neat, it's warm and friendly. But sustainability literally means it can be continued. And lack of sustainability means, of course, the opposite. This cannot continue. This will not continue. Exactly where this is going, I guess, is anybody's guess. I guess that's what we're here tonight to discuss. But trust me, we will not have an ever-increasing consumption of fossil energy for a great number of reasons. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. As a matter of fact, we get at this to some degree here, not only the picture of the 6,600-pound Cadillac Escalade, one of my least favorite automobiles on the planet, but the other issues that are so associated with all of this. In other words, we all talk about energy being inexorably bound up with water and food supply, and the fact of what we're doing to our food supply. The bottom picture, obviously, a representation of the fact that as we utilize, agribusiness goes crazy with respect to growing crops we run into horrific problems with insecticides, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and so forth. But let's go back to this whole issue of energy and talk a little bit more about this. So obviously, energy is the capacity to do useful work. It's defined as in physics that way. So, and I wanted to talk about, you may not know this fellow, this Japanese physicist, very kind of personable fellow if you YouTube him, you'll find him speaking for a very long time. Fantastic presenter. But he talks about class 1, class 2, and class 3 civilizations. Class 1 being civilizations that have figured out how to power themselves from their local star. So in other words, he notes, and you all know, that the Earth receives 6,000 times more energy every day from the sun than all 7 billion of us are consuming. So if we had just some mechanism of harvesting and using 1 over 6,000, that tiny fraction of that energy, we could all go home. We could all pretend we never heard of fossil fuels and nuclear and so forth and so on. But we don't. So we're not even very close to being a class 1 civilization, let alone a class 2 or class 3 civilization. And by my wits, the real issue in this, I'm a fair-minded guy. So I tend to think of this in economic terms. I tend not to say, we need to just stop this. We need to tell rich people that they can't be rich anymore, and we need to tell meat eaters that they can't eat cows anymore, and so forth and so on. I tend not to do that. I tend to say, let us figure out how we can simply pay for what we're consuming. I don't have a problem. If people want to burn coal, I'm not in favor of that. I'm doing everything I can in my life's work to put an end to the combustion of coal on this planet. Having said that, I can't really object to people doing things if they're willing to pay for it. The problem is they're not. So the externalities of the way we generate energy, coal being a wonderful example, though there are others, is simply this, that there are parts of that transaction. We're paying whatever it is, 11 cents a kilowatt hour on average for electricity in the United States, about a third of which comes from coal. Is anybody paying for the long-term damage to our respiratory systems or our environment? Climate change, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity? No. Okay, that's an externalized cost that is being passed along to perhaps our grandchildren, but wherever it's going, it's certainly not being captured and covered and paid for in what we're doing now. Now, I encourage you, this I'm sure you can't read from where you are, but on the website, my card is in the back, twogreenenergy.com is a website in which I've made, I think, 200 and change videos presenting the basics of energy and renewable energy and the physics associated with this and so forth and so on, largely to newcomers, often to school kids. I know I've helped a zillion kids with their papers from 6th grade to, I had a graduate student in the University of Malaysia a couple weeks ago. I walked through his dissertation, so forth and so on. I love this stuff, and I love to create what I refer to as kind of the basics of this. This has to do with looking at all of the energy that is available to us as 4 independent paths from the Big Bang. And there's tons of other material on this thing. I hope you get a chance to check that out. Okay, so energy, this is not simple. I mean, part of what keeps me alive on this thing is that if this were a simple conversation, it probably would have been solved by now. This is an enormously complicated one for largely, and the technology is part of it. We have, when you think of renewable energy, you think of solar, wind, biomass, hydrokinetics, and geothermal, and the millions of sub-flavors of those. When you think of the rest of this stuff, obviously there are hydrocarbons that we can continue to find, extract, and burn. We have nuclear energy, which, anybody who lives on this planet is aware of the safety issues associated with not only operation, but waste disposal. So you've got the technology thing, which I find very interesting. I don't know how anybody couldn't, really. But frankly, it pales in comparison to the economics and the politics on this thing. If we really wanted to do this, the technology exists this afternoon to get this done. It's not a horrible problem if we have the political will to do this, which we don't. And that's what I consider to be the more interesting thing. So for instance, in the United States, because I happen to live here, I'm much more familiar with the discussion about how corrupt our government is. In other words, how we elect our senators and representatives based on big money, lots of which comes from here. So you've got a Republican senator in Oklahoma who recently told the US Navy that it can't spend a penny more for fuel, for biofuel, than it can for oil that comes from crude. Now, the Navy said, well, we don't want to power our whole fleet with, corn ethanol, but we do. Just keep in mind, sir, that we're in charge of protecting the nation now, and not only now, but 30 years from now, and we consider this a strategically important. And the guy goes, well, I don't care what you consider strategically important. I'm making it impossible. I'm making it a law that you can't do this. And I'm reading this and I go, well, this sounds like treason. Isn't anybody paying attention to this? So, I mean, the discussions are really that ludicrous. So I chose a dandy, but trust me, I could talk for a very long while.
And you feel like you have a little bit of Thomas Paine, you want to write your common sense short and sweet that every common person can read and run around explaining that to the masses?
I suppose. I tried to keep an active dialogue going on the website. I have about 9,000 subscribers to my newsletter, and I try to encourage all of them. Some of them are inventors, and I try to get them to submit business plans. Some of them are advocates, and I try to get them active in this discussion too. But good point. And by the way, go ahead.
Is that video available of the senator saying that, or is it just an article?
My link to it in the numerous things I've written about it is just a link, but I'm sure you could find it if you wanted. It's Jim Inhofe is the guy, the particular, reptile I just quoted on that. Yes. Right. Okay, having said that, you remind me, Enrique, that I should pause for questions. So this doesn't have to be, I'm probably, I don't know, halfway through this thing. I can continue or take questions as they come up. If you have
something burning and something you'd like to share, feel free.
All right, well, we'll do it a little bit later on. But when I talk about this long and complex discussion, this slide and the next one have to do with just random, unconnected issues on this. So we talked about the first one. Here's the second one. I was conducting an interview with Ray Lane, who's the managing partner of Kleiner Perkins, probably the most obvious venture capital firm in the United States. I can't say that he's a friend, but he's an acquaintance I've met at a great number of conferences. And I was in his office, and here's what he says about this whole energy issue. It's about patriotism. He goes, I'm not a marketing guy, but if I were, Americans don't like to lose. You may recall George C. Scott's version of Patton, I think 1970, where he goes, America loves a winner and will not tolerate a loser. And we're only 7 or 8 years away from becoming the second largest economy in the world. And more particular, and he goes, well, I don't know what Americans are going to feel like the day they wake up and they're no longer the economic leader. I'm not particularly taken by that, but I do wonder how it is that Americans are somehow, everybody's aware of the incredible job we did leading IT and communications and networking, the whole internet thing over the last 20 years, that has picked up where, I guess, manufacturing left off after the baby boom, hit the streets after World War II. But we're famously doing an abysmal job here in the early 21st century. Anybody who's paying any level of attention to this thing can see that energy, and in particular this kind of transition, this migration from traditional to alternative or new energy, is the most important topic in the world economy in the 21st century. And that's even if we can, depending on how long we can forestall the whole discussion of climate change and so forth. Anything could happen any day that would accelerate the discussion even further. But my question is, why? I just don't really understand how Americans have become tolerant of the fact that we just simply sit around and bicker with one another while the rest of the world, China in particular, but pick your country in terms of Japan or Germany or what have you, making enormous investments and becoming fantastically affluent, driven by the understanding of investment in future technology. It's not, we're not going to be building new ways of harvesting. We're not going to be, the 21st century economy is not going to be about raising barns and building bigger cars, I think. I mean, the whole thing is a little scary to me. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Supreme Court decision, U.S. Supreme Court decision, January 2010, called Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. But it essentially granted the rights, the protection of free speech under the First Amendment to corporations, to fictitious persons. Which means, among other things, not to put too fine a point on it, that ExxonMobil, who made $41 billion last quarter, can spend every nickel out of it they want, making sure that Enrique wins this next election and Craig loses, or whatever they want. So in other words, the concept of the legitimacy of our democracy in the United States has gone completely out the window. Fortunately, there are numerous and extremely effective movements at overturning this largely through a constitutional amendment. So I hope that happens. Point number 4, peak oil. So it's not true that we're at the end that we've run out of oil, unfortunately. It is true that we've run out of cheap, easy to find, clean, relatively clean oil. So this whole concept of peak oil is a very interesting one. Tar sands, I'm sure you're aware, is the dirtiest of oil, and comes with.
What about all the oil that's in North Dakota and the oil that's right out here?
Well, we are pumping whatever we can out of they're pockets of the world.
The channel out here has got more oil
Yeah.
than the whole Middle East.
Well, no.
We're not drilling it because we don't want to, because this is ground zero for the environmental.
Yes, there are issues. You may be aware of the Stop Oil Seeps of California. So there's an organization here in Santa Barbara called Stop Oil Seeps, SOS California, which is, believe it or not, run by environmentalists. So you've got minor fluctuations. I mean, this whole thing isn't exactly black and white. Here, ironically, you do the environment a favor. The environment doesn't care whether this is an oil spill, whether this is seeping up out of the ground, or whether it's the Exxon Valdez. So ironically, you can do the environment a favor by oil drilling in this specific case, but that's certainly not the case on a kind of planetary level. Okay, next you have the issue that I find very interesting, that we are programmed to be consumers. Certainly since the Second World War, and you could argue that it started earlier, but the whole concept of convincing masses of people that they're fundamentally, personally inadequate if they don't smell right, they don't drink the right beer, etc. They don't look sharp, they're not sexually attractive, etc. This has grown to the point where it's about consumption of stuff. And consumption of stuff largely means more energy used in extracting it, refining it, building it, shipping it, consuming it, and throwing it away. So the fact that more and more people every day are, instead of just saying, I've got a perfectly fine laptop that's 12 years old, it runs everything I need to. When people look at it, they go, oh, you're not very cool, are you? You got a 12-year-old laptop? I guess it's more correctly 8 or 10 years, but that's ancient. I might as well be driving a 1935 car. People are programmed to think like this nowadays. So in other words, we want newer, better stuff. Another way of looking at this is what I refer to, it's not I, but I guess it's Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, who talks about Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. And this is very much a theme of these books. And that is, Plan A is simply just believe what you're being told. There's no real problem associated with our process of economic growth, expansion, energy consumption. It'll all come out all right. It always has, and it always will. So you can believe that if you want. That's what I refer to as Plan A. Plan B, there are numerous people who say we can grow our way out of this thing by simply embracing the economic opportunity that clean tech represents. I'm not sure of that. But before I get there, let me tell you what Plan C is. There are numerous people, extremely estimable people who have studied this thing for decades, who say that's baloney. Plan B, it won't work. We cannot grow our way out of this thing. We are looking at a long, sustained period of negative economic growth. We don't like that, but that's what we're headed toward, whether we like it or not. And the last guy I spoke with about this said, Craig, we grew up. I was born in '55, so I was a kid in the '60s when our energy consumption was much less than it is now. And he goes, we didn't have miserable childhoods. We played outside, and most of what we did was actually very fun and very healthy. And we didn't need, enormous amounts of electronics all around us, and we didn't need to be jetting all over the world and so forth. We had life. There's enough intrinsic pleasure in life without that kind of extrinsic issue associated with it. And lastly, no free lunch. So it is true, and I have another one of those kind of Big Bang type slides that talks about the pros and cons of all of this. So for instance, wind, just to take one, wind energy, the energy input, people say, well, you're extracting metal to make wind turbines, and then you're killing birds and bats and so forth and so on. You're doing more harm than good. No, you're not. The energy consumption associated with building a wind turbine, installing it, using it for its useful life, and deinstalling it is 1/30th the amount of energy that you're going to take out of it. And it is true that they whack an occasional bird, but a bird is 800 times more likely to run into a plate glass window and 1,200 more times more likely to be eaten by a cat than it is to get killed by a...
Does everybody remember that so they can use that in arguments at the cocktail parties?
No.
That's an argument you hear on a regular basis.
Yes.
When the birds, the owls, the rain.
800 more times more likely to run into a plate glass window and 1,200 more times more likely to be eaten by a cat, or normally a house cat. And I don't think we're right around the corner from outlawing house cats. It's also 400 times more likely to get hit by a car, and we're certainly not doing anything with respect to that. Okay. So here's the bottom line on this. This is, if there ever were an obviously unsustainable path, I don't know how much more obvious that this can be. So I guess the question then, I often ask people, what would you do if you were the king of the world? Not that that's anything but a moot point, but there are. When you look at the paper and you read, well, this is a big deal in today's culture. You go, really? We're arguing about that when all of this is happening? And that we're a few decades away from catastrophic climate change that's going to displace, hundreds of millions of people? And the end of, water shortages and enormous food shortages? And we're worried about this? Are you serious? So it's an interesting... I guess it's a PR world. It's a media-driven world, and nobody's outside of the 15 of you in this room. Nobody's asking me, so we'll see what happens. So I guess the question is, will we avoid catastrophe? And the truth is, I'm not exactly sure. But I have a friend who is a born-again Christian who looks at this as the telling of the unfolding of Revelations. And he and I obviously don't agree on that, but I'm not nasty about it. But what I tell him is this: A, I don't believe you. But even if I did, don't I have a duty? I would think I would have a duty if I think that God has a plan for me and that this is a loving God up there looking at what I'm doing and saying right now. I would think He's going to say, I applaud you're doing something about this. I don't think sitting around and hoping that this is the end of the world is consistent with the thinking of a loving God, but that's another topic for sure. I told you this is going to be wide-ranging, didn't I? I wasn't lying. All right, now, let me conclude by telling you this. When I first conceived of this talk, it didn't have this and the next slide in it. And then I realized that it might be, there are entrepreneurs in this room. I'm an entrepreneur. I've done fairly well in business over the years. Though I'll tell you what, Paul Hawken, who's one of my heroes, great environmentalist for as long as I've been around, points out that environmental isn't a way to get rich, it's a way to be rich. And he certainly got something on the ball with respect to that. I'm not saying that we can't get wealthy doing this. As a matter of fact, there's going to be $7 trillion. I guess I should have asked this question. This gentleman would have nailed me on this. $7 trillion going to be invested in renewable energy by, I go to the Renewable Energy Finance Forum twice a year. And they're not, I mean, there are a couple of venture capitalists sitting around with probably kind of minor checkbooks or angel investors who want to be, put a couple $100,000 here, a couple $100,000 there. But the speakers at these things who are telling us guardedly about their plans and what they're doing over a period of decades, and how they're spending $7 trillion with a T dollars associated with this. This is Citibank, this is Deutsche Bank, this is J.P. Morgan. These are the concept that, which is one of the myths about this, that this doesn't make any sense unless the government pays for it, or that this is a minor fad, or it's cute, or that it's a hobby for leftover hippies. That's a lie. And when I say it's a lie, all you have to do is show up at one of these finance forums and look at the people there and what they're doing, and you can see it pretty quickly. But what I thought I would do is talk to whatever degree you want to hear this. I guess I'll go through this quickly and then just entertain questions on the subject. But it seems to me that over a long period of time, and even over a short period of time, you're going to have enormous amount of profit potential in electric transportation with the right form factor. Certainly in batteries, one of my clients has a breakthrough in zinc air. There are zillions of different battery chemistry. Zinc air is particularly promising, and these guys have nailed this. Not to say that other people couldn't. Telematics having to do with the use of communications and information technology to communicate to and from automobiles. Solar thermal, of which this is a picture here. Solar thermal, you're probably aware that photovoltaics transfers incident photons, it kicks out electrons which flow in a circuit. Solar thermal captures the sun's energy as heat, and you can store, Dan here has a interest in energy storage. You can store heat energy a lot less expensively, even given this breakthrough in zinc air batteries, than you can electrical energy. And also, solar thermal lags, I'll say, at least 25 or 30 years behind the R&D cycles of photovoltaics and wind. And there are breakthroughs. Another one of my clients has what I think to be a real game changer with respect to solar thermal. I'm helping him move that along. Smart grid. The funny part to me about smart grid is that I read what municipalities, maybe counties, maybe states are doing with respect to all this. And they say, by God, we have a renewable portfolio standard, an RPS, and by God, we're going to have 25% of our electricity generated from renewable sources in the next 15 years. And then you ask them about smart grid, and they go, ooh, smart grid's a little futuristic. We'll worry about that sometime later. Cart before the horse. Smart grid is the enabler of so much of this stuff, and especially efficiency. Yes, things like this, many square mile solar thermal field are sexy, but the real low-hanging fruit in terms of all of the sustainable energy practice lies in efficiency, simply figuring out how to use less of this stuff. And smart grid is a huge enabler of that, and there are companies I can talk about that are doing a magnificent job with respect to that. I happen to believe, one of the interviews in my first book is with a guy who was very close to cold fusion and the whole Fleischmann-Pons thing in '89 and so forth and so on. He believes, and I kind of believe it because he believes it, very senior physicist from Caltech, that there is something to cold fusion, that there is a kind of a conspiracy to cover up what is actually credible technology. I don't know. He believes it. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with respect to fusion in a great number of its flavors. Storage. So we talked a little bit about storage. There are different ways of getting at storage. Obviously enables the integration of large amounts of intermittent resources, or what I refer to as variable resources, because the sun, obviously the sun doesn't shine at night, and the wind doesn't blow with the same velocity all the time at the same place. But these resources are call it what you will, but variable to integrating large amounts of this. We're at about 4% wind here in the United States now and about 1% solar. Storage is a non-issue at that penetration, but if you want to go to 20 or 30%, it becomes an issue. So energy storage is a big deal, and there are 5 or 6 major flavors of that coming along. And as I say, energy efficiency really is the low-hanging fruit. If you want to really make a breakthrough in something that's going to make a change, that's a good place to look. I'm also, I'll talk about the bottom one first, environmental law. I know absolutely nothing about environmental law except that this is a big deal, especially in the United States. These renewable energy finance forums I find kind of amusing because people will say, they're sponsored by lawyers, and there'll be 600 or 800 people in a room, and somebody will say, this last one I attended, I couldn't believe this. The guy goes, in Germany, and this is true, in Germany, they've handled this, the whole process of permitting and developing and installing PV to a degree. They don't need any lawyers. This whole thing is just completely, it's like getting a permit to, grow daisies in your backyard. It's extremely, it's either not required at all or it's so standard it's a non-issue. Here, of course, it takes years and years, and if you want to do something with PV, it's one thing. If you want to do something with water, it's worse. There are 40 or 50 different agencies that touch water. So you want to put, a hydrokinetic, a device that extracts energy from moving water, be prepared to wrestle with Fish and Game and Parks and Recreation and, various environmental issues and so forth. So anyway, the guy at the Renewable Energy Finance Forum goes, this is no longer about business. This is about law. It's about paying people $400 an hour so that they can write extraneous garbage into a contract that shouldn't have existed in the first place, that now they can be paid to negotiate with one another. So all I can say, this thing was sponsored by the largest environmental law firm in the United States, and you could have heard a pin drop when this guy said that. I thought I was good at upsetting people and saying, in making insulting remarks. This guy really took the cake. But I mean, the point is, environmental law is a big thing, for better or for worse. So enough on that. And lastly, the future of transportation. Now, I don't know where we're going with respect to transportation. I've alluded to electric transportation, which, as long as there's coal burned anywhere in the United States, when you put in an incremental load on the grid in the United States, you are essentially causing more coal to be burned. It doesn't matter what the average grid mix is, or the fact that we don't burn any coal in the state of California. It doesn't matter, because you plug in an electric vehicle and you want to get 25 kilowatt hours out of your socket between now and the time you get out of bed in the morning. You're causing more coal to be burned. As long as that's the case, electric transportation has dubious environmental benefits. Having said that, we are getting to the point where people are putting up more PV, more wind, micro wind, mid-sized wind, charging EVs with renewable sources is a wonderful thing. We are eliminating coal plants. They're being retired. The environmental protection associated with coal plants is much more stringent now than it's ever been in the past. We are moving in the right direction with respect to that. Having said that, the whole paradigm of transportation, I think, is a little strange. When we think of we think of personal transportation as a car that weighs, 40 times what I do, sitting in my garage, that I use an hour out of every 24, and 70% of the hour I'm using it has only one passenger. The whole thing is so the paradigm, it shouldn't be replacing one big expensive hunk of steel with another one. We need to rethink transportation in terms of a great number of different eventualities, including car sharing, ride sharing, mass transportation, little bitty urban commuters, etc. So the whole concept of rethinking the way we live and work and move ourselves and our cargo around, redesigning our cities to facilitate walking and bicycling and so forth. There are going to be changes associated with that. I represent that as a potential economic boon simply because, again, sustainability literally means that it can be continued. And what we're doing here simply cannot be continued. And when you think about it, the average family spends $40 a day in automotive. Couple of cars, gasoline, maintenance, insurance, etc. Unfortunately, there's not a car guy who comes along, car guy, every day and says, $40 please. Eventually you'd go, damn, is it really costing that much to do this? Yes, it is. So eventually you'd understand that not only is this economically unaffordable, but environmentally unaffordable, but economically as well. And that is what I think is going to power this kind of paradigm shift in transportation. Okay, well, thank you very much. I would like to just, I promised this would be wide-ranging. I hope I lived up to that at least. And please fire away with questions. No, thank you. Questions or comments?
You mentioned the whole issue of how information is being transmitted to the media. I'd like to call your attention to a documentary that just came out, which I was actually blown away by, called Shadows of Liberty.
Okay.
Have you heard of it?
No.
I think you could probably watch it on the internet. I'm not sure. Actually, there's a TV station that's on the cable now through KCBT called Link TV. I'm like, how do these guys get space on the networks? I mean, on the cable, because they're really raising some very interesting and very serious questions. And I'd suggest that if you get a chance to see that, anybody else who hasn't, Shadows of Liberty. And it's credible news people. It's not some character coming out from behind a barn somewhere. These are people, actually people that had worked for the major networks. They were given, some of them were given the boot because some of the stories they were chasing were getting a little too close to, I guess, making
Shadows
some...
of what?
Shadows of Liberty. And there's a book, there's a former professor out here, the head of the Environmental Studies Department, Daniel Botkin, wrote a book called Powering the Future.
Okay.
Do you know that book?
I've heard of it, but
And I would highly recommend you look at it because basically he's done the research. He's an ecologist like you. He's not a professional energy person, but he has had access to some major people that know the fields. And his conclusion is that we can now shift to renewable energy that does not include nuclear power, does not include natural gas, except as a transition perhaps. But the solar and wind and conservation, and do it successfully and come out ahead in the long run. And by the way, I was going to say that whole thing about the oil out here. I don't know who told you that there's more oil out here than Saudi Arabia, but that sounds to me a bit of an exaggeration. And the oil that's out there, by the way, is about the consistency of asphalt. To get it out, they have to use high pressure steam, very similar to fracking, and diluents, which are really nasty, nasty, nasty chemicals. And in fact, we had the largest spill of oil-related chemicals off of Guadalupe Beach about 10 or so years ago, larger than the Exxon Valdez. And the only reason it didn't cause a flap was that it wasn't dark and gooey, but it was probably as toxic or more so than regular petroleum that comes out of the ground. So the whole idea of we're going to drill our way out of our properties is...
Could you summarize some of the points and the references you made and email me so I could get that out to people? That might be helpful. Thank you, Michael.
thank you. Please.
You mentioned Wall Street or the financial institutions making some kind of move or spending more time and money, hopefully, on environmental causes or enterprises. I mean, how has that come about? Do you feel that they've been forced to it? Have they voluntarily gone there, or how are they creating that market in their own minds?
Well, I think that they're certainly not forced to do it. I think you take
Electric is a good example of a Fortune 10 company that wants to own the world as it goes green. I'm not in their boardroom, obviously, but the decision making at a strategic level is pretty obvious, and that shows me that they have a plant in Louisville, Kentucky that makes all their appliances sold in the Western Hemisphere, or in the United States anyway, and there's a computer in every one. Okay, so in other words, they're contemplating a world in which smart grid helps us understand the way we're consuming energy. And so in other words, it's not about, I mean, it may be about altruism, I'd like to think it is, but there's no reason to think it is. There's every reason to think it is about profit making in the 21st century, and as I say, owning the world as it goes green. Mm-hmm. Please.
A couple of things. I'm not a real consumer, and I don't consume much electricity, and I'm happy, and I'm happy with that lifestyle. But I think not a lot of people, a percentage of the population worldwide wants to have all the cool stuff and technology and use energy, not just to use energy, but to do new things and to have cars and to have computers and all that stuff. So I think bringing forward clean, sustainable energy to a diminished or the perception of a diminished lifestyle is good.
Right.
I think that a lot of people, given the choice to be able to live a cool life sustainably, will do it, and a lot of people won't.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're given alternatives that are just put forward to them,
Yes.
that they'll take those alternatives clean and
Here's what I
sustainable.
think about that candidate.
I see what you're saying, and I agree. I don't think many people are going to be changing their minds on this thing. I often wonder what it's going to be like when it becomes cool to be green, just like it's cool to do whatever young people think is cool. And I do think that the paradigm shifts on a sociologic level are not unprecedented. I'm reminded of the time I was, I think, 6 or 7, when my mother used to go out to her cocktail parties in her minks. And her friends, everybody had a mink. A year later, you couldn't find a mink in southeastern Pennsylvania where I grew up, because everybody, almost instantaneously, had gotten the message that this is a stupid, barbaric, unacceptable way of dressing. Now, unfortunately, not everybody, I mean, you can still find minks. There's been some flip-flop on this thing, but here's my point, is that people do catch on. People do change their things. Different things become cool and sweeping in society. And here's another thing, and I hate to sound callous on this thing, but old people are getting old, and you know what happens when you get old? You die. And that's what's happening. The whole world is eventually going to be replaced. I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. In other words, young people are becoming more and more dominant, and the kind of thought process of young people, this whole sustainability thing means more to young people than it does to an older generation, I think.
Well, I love sustainability, and I promote it and working towards it. But there's people still who love NASCAR.
Yeah.
And I've been to a NASCAR race,
Yeah.
and I was thrilled when that power of those engines came by.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, the adventuresome side of me, I was thrilled.
Okay.
What technology, what power.
Yeah.
And I think if you go after those people, saying that appreciating good engines is wrong, that then you're going to get
Yes.
opposing camps.
Exactly.
And so I say it's great. It's a great thing, but we can't do it in mass. Some people can do it, but basically, as a group, we've got to move towards sustainability, and that because we've been in a cultural civil war since the '60s, and we're still in it.
Yes.
And so when you have opposing camps, then everybody states their point of view, but it goes nowhere.
Right. Well, speaking of opposing camps, here's what I think happens in the United States. There is no centrist, moderate, middle ground of people who understand this and want something, a practical solution. If you want to run for dog catcher, you either go immediately to the right and say, there's nothing the matter with this. Are you some sort of socialist? Just keep drilling and burning. Or you move immediately to the left and you go, we have to stop this afternoon. Both of them are equally impractical. But try to find somebody who goes, look, we need a transition over a period of a couple of decades away from this. We need to be doing this. We need an energy policy. The United States has none. It's not like we're short on policies. We just happen to have no energy policy. And that's not an accident. It's because this is controlled by, this is the largest, the oil companies hire more lobbyists than any other industry in the known universe. This isn't an accident.
Well, the oil history.
Right.
In human history
Right.
worldwide.
Right.
So they control a lot of things. But if you read Barry Goldwater, who everybody was abhorred by, who was liberal, what he wrote and what Eisenhower said, there was a lot more moderation. And Barry Goldwater was talking about supporting diversity and spiritual freedom.
Yes. Yep.
Along with his other stuff.
Yep.
So,
I'm with you. Very good.
I think I'll just say one more thing.
Okay.
I want to get in. There's a huge disconnect, because I go to a lot of conferences too, or have. There's a huge disconnect between the excitement that is at those conferences and the progress that's been made.
Yes.
And what's available and the financial dollars that are behind all that are available
Yes.
to move, and what the public knows and understands.
Yes. Oh, I forgot to tell you the punchline. You're absolutely right, by the way. I forgot to tell you the punchline about the guy the Republican from Oklahoma, Inhofe. 80% of his campaign contributions come from the oil companies. 80%, $4 out of every $5. So he's there purely because of the oil companies, and he's the one who's trying to make it illegal for the U.S. Navy to buy, to do their R&D and so forth with biofuels. I wrote to him and I said, look, I'm not going to get into the histrionics and call you a treasonous bastard or whatever, but all I'm saying is that you have the most egregious conflict of interest I've ever seen. I've been in business 35 years. I've never seen one as gross as what you're doing. You need to go. So, whatever.
It is treason. You could call it a slut.
One right here.
Okay?
First.
Please. Yes, I'm sorry.
You mentioned countries other than the United States are doing more for environmentalism, and if you could identify those countries. And then my question is, if we don't, as the world, do it in unison, what would it possibly matter? I mean, it's a good example, but I'm concerned, and so first I'd like to hear which these countries are.
Well, largely, I mean, when you think about this,
You often think of Germany, who made just, in the last 20 years, made an enormous dedication to solar in a region of the world that doesn't have a lot of solar irradiation. So, but they mustered the political will through a guy, Hermann Scheer, who died just a couple of years ago, unfortunately. But he was instrumental in becoming a kind of father of PV in Northern Europe. But the totality of Europe, Spain is very big in solar and actually CSP, that solar thermal thing I showed you earlier. They're the kind of the mecca of solar thermal. So, but the ethos, in addition to the kind of political issue on this thing, that people think about this very differently. Going back to Dan's point about how do people kind of contemplate their own existence as citizens of the world. It's much different in Europe than it is in the United States. And your other question, which I thought was very good, was, okay, that's a hard question to answer. Your other question was and by the way, I could go on. Brazil is doing a great job with sugarcane-based ethanol. They've decided they don't want another drop of gasoline in their country. And biofuels, I could go into the pros and cons of biofuels, but trust me, they're doing an extremely concentrated job in transitioning from crude-generated oil to this ethanol. China is just formalized their 12th five-year plan, and there are 8 or 10 different and extremely robust dedications, commitments to renewable energy of a great number of ways. Of course, they've got their own issues. They got a completely different political system, and they have their own issues with respect to, the huge populations demanding energy. And they also have their own, you can't see across the street in Beijing half the time because of the pollution. So they've got a different set of issues there. But the question is, what's the imperative for an individual or even an individual country to do something like this thing aggressively when the rest of the world isn't? And there are different ways of answering that. I think the most...
I didn't say it that way, though.
Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The pessimist view is, what will be the outcome if we don't do it in unison?
I see.
And to make a little tidbit here, I went to Earth Day and I signed this petition not to harvest human organs.
Okay.
I signed the petition, I wasn't sure I should sign, and I was really quite aghast that these people said, I said, well, why am I signing this? And they said, because we want the United States to come over and solve the problem. So I went around telling my son and my husband, you know, I signed it, but it just kind of made it confusing to me that we're supposed to come solve the problem. So to relate it to the question I asked, okay, China's doing all this, doesn't impress me when they're doing this other.
Sure.
Brazil, the same thing. I mean, who's kidding who? They're not, the world is not consciously doing this in unison, and that's the only way it's gonna get solved.
Well, you could say that. I happen to be,
Rajendra Pujari, who's the head of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And so his job, unlovely as it may be, is to go from these conferences in, you know, Copenhagen and Durban and Cancun and so forth, the conference of parties, and talk up, you know, the Kyoto Protocol and the modern versions of this thing. And I go, that must be depressing, because I'm not at these conferences, but I certainly read about them. And I go, this sounds a little on the hopeless side. And he goes, I don't want to talk about that on the record. And I go, okay, well, the interview's over anyway. I'll just turn off this microphone. He goes, yeah, this is a disaster. We were in, I guess it was Durban he had just returned from in South Africa. And he goes, we were there for a week. We couldn't come up with a single sentence, a single declarative sentence that talked about what we had accomplished. Not a single sentence. We had to stay 2 extra days to work out some completely platitudinous, worthless statement of what all these people had spent all this time, all these resources trying to get done. So I'm sure you're aware that at a high level, the argument becomes the developed countries don't want to do this because the developing countries won't or can't. And the developing countries go, we can't afford to do this. You have to help us do this. You can't expect, you guys lived like hogs for 100 years. You can't expect us to pay the price for your overindulgence. So both of them have reasonable points to make. I'm glad Dr. Pujari, I'm glad I don't have his job. I don't think I could do any better job, that's for sure. So I hear you, I understand. I'm not sure it will happen as a result of human beings coming together. I'd love to see something like that happen. I think we're a million miles from that. And certainly we're a million miles of having this happen on the Beltway, per what I've been talking about. Ed Rendell, the ex-governor of Pennsylvania, said a couple of months ago to a group that I happen to be a part of, he goes, do you realize, if you expect this to happen in Washington, you're an idiot. He goes, the oil companies host fundraisers to elect and re-elect your leaders 7 days a week. He goes, it never stops. If you think that's going to, if you think you're going to get some level of honesty and decency out of that process, you're a fool. He goes, having said that, it is happening in hometown America, and it is happening, ironically, in corporate America for the reasons that we talked about before. In other words, there are companies that go, this is the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to do for shareholders, because this is the industry of the 21st century. So I hear what you're saying. I don't know how to respond otherwise.
I think carbon credits is a good micro example of how it has been internationalized and its affect different regions. I just came from Indonesia, and there's a hot little market there for generating businesses that get carbon credits that are then sold to European and American companies so that they can balance their SO2 emissions and so on. So there is a mechanism, there are efforts, they aren't tried and true, I mean, it's still experimental, but it is happening.
Absolutely. If I were in charge of this thing,
going back to what I would do if I were the king of the world, it goes back to this thing of fairness and internalizing the externalities. And that's a good example of an effort to do that, the carbon credit thing. But my point of this thing is it's essentially tax and incentive. I mean, carbon credits is an example of that. But I don't understand why there simply can't be a tax associated with things that are costing our society huge amounts of money. The Harvard Medical School report on coal in the United States, it costs us $700 billion a year to deal with a quarter of that, or a quarter trillion is health issues associated with asthma and lung cancer and so forth. The rest of it is environmental damage and various other components. $700 billion a year. I say, if you want to continue to do that, that's your business, but pay for it. I think that if you internalize the externalities associated with this, renewable energy would be the deal of the century. People, all of this stuff would be gone by tomorrow afternoon. People would say, I don't want to pay 40 cents a kilowatt for electricity. Well, and I go, good, then just turn off that coal plant and everybody's fine.
Yeah, I think Wall Street has actually gotten around it, or I should say the financial institutions have actually come around. For example, this carbon credit, they've been big sponsors. A lot of them went first, but I think they're well ensconced in the whole idea now. So it does work. It takes a lot of time.
Right.
Please.
I feel like one of the issues is that there is a lack of a model of true sustainable, using true sustainable living, using renewable energy for manufacturing, clean water, food, shelter, which is all sustainable.
Yes.
And that model has to be created so that people know that there's another way that they can embrace. Because right now there really isn't another way. I mean, you turn on the switch, you don't know where this electricity is coming from.
It's true.
And they merge everything anyway. So
Yes.
you may be paying extra for wind, but you're actually paying who knows for what?
Right.
Nuclear, coal, whatever.
Yes.
So I've been in the renewable, in sustainability. We work with different technology developers, renewable energy,
Yes.
water and other technologies,
Yep.
and then we implement them in building sustainable infrastructure. And so this is what we're doing now. We're creating these infrastructure hubs in Africa, starting with Africa, because there really is no energy there. There
Right.
is generators to manufacture everything.
Yes.
And so we're starting where there really is no power, then transiting to the countries like India, which
Yes.
have power but not enough.
Yep.
And then finally, hopefully, the United States and Europe will wake up and start embracing a model
great.
like that.
Good. Well, from your lips to God's ears, as they say. I love the concept, by the way, of leapfrogging the fossil fuel industry in the developing world. I was just on the phone a couple of hours ago with a guy, and the conversation got to this exact thing, where the real issue of sustainability is so tied into population growth. And that is tied into education. Educated families don't have 15 kids. So if you care about this, and you obviously do, and so do we all, it seems to me that the real, speaking of low-hanging fruit, is bringing renewable energy to foster education in the developing world. So in other words, bringing lighting, computing, refrigeration to the developing world. And women in particular. I have a friend who runs a wonderful foundation in the way eastern parts of Venezuela. And I ask him about what's the philosophy, what are you trying to get done? And he talks about women. He goes, when you invest in men, you wind up with Vespas and beer. When you invest in women, you wind up with smaller, stronger, better, better families. I
totally agree. In fact, we're starting a grassroots women entrepreneurship program, starting with Africa and India, where we will actually make available, I'm not saying we're not donating, we're giving it to them on loan, a few solar panels. They will start their own utility company and sell electricity to the village.
Nice.
There's a whole engagement process there, because normally if you just donate a bunch of panels, they fall into disuse or misuse, they're stolen, they're whatever.
Yes.
These women, their livelihood depends on it.
Yep.
And so this is the way to do ground up work in entrepreneurship, and we're engaging the women, because there's a whole class of women now who are, because of public education, they have graduated from high school, but they don't know where to work. There are no jobs for them.
Yes, sir.
And so this will create an opening for them, the kids will get educated, and we move forward.
Magnificent. Great. Yes. Good. Please.
One question I've had about, I should let you go, because you haven't said anything, so I'll wait. Hold on.
go ahead first.
Then I'll try to be brief. I'm sort of stymied by the fact that, and maybe I shouldn't be, because there's probably a way of doing this, but I cannot understand, the city of Santa Barbara, for instance, which likes to tout itself as the birthplace of the environmental movement, which I would like to tell you is complete malarkey. It's very misleading, but it's an interesting thing to think about. I mean, we did have a role in this town, but it wasn't the only place. But irregardless, why, with all that sort of hoopla about the environment here, we can't solarize the roofs of every building in town, create our own little utility districts,
Mandatory.
and run our own, without, say thanks Edison for all your help for these years, but, first of all, for national security, for one, and for just general security when you have disasters, they're finding that smaller utility setups are much more resilient
And efficient.
and efficient. That's one thing. Oh, and one thing about traders, and I love to talk about the oil companies. I have to say, one of the reasons I'm able to sit in this room and articulate fairly cogently is because my childhood was paid by the oil companies. My father was not very proud of that, but he did make a living in the oil business for most, and I learned a fair amount from him because of that. But one of the things I remember him telling me was, first of all, he couldn't stand it, but it was a job. The other thing is that when he was a young man, he was working for Standard Oil in New Jersey. I think it was 1940 or 41. He was working in oil tankers out of Bayonne, New Jersey, and sailing mainly down to Venezuela. But they took one trip with aviation gas to, guess where?
Hamburg.
Yeah, Hamburg, Germany. And do you know what that aviation gas was being used for?
Bomb England.
Bombing our ally, the English. I mean, for people that don't know about the history of this country, the real history, it could make your head explode. And I said, well, what about Japan? Oh, he says, well, we were sending, in neutral hulls. These are basically ships from the Portuguese and the Swedish, and other neutral countries. Yeah, I think even the Swiss had a merchant fleet, and the Irish. We're shipping oil and fuel from U.S. ports to our enemies, so-called. Now, if I were to do that as an individual, I would be a traitor, wouldn't I? So Standard Oil, Texaco, and all these other, Shell, you go down the list, they really don't give a damn. And I cannot understand why that isn't better understood.
It's a multinational corporation, and every time a foreigner tells me about America's the problem, I say these people are so rich, they don't care where they live, and if America goes down, they will live in Timbuktu, and it's a multinational. They are higher than the CIA, they're higher than everyone else.
Truly. But those days they weren't. I mean, I'm talking about World War II. Basically, they were traitors. They,
Joseph Kennedy over in England.
Prescott Bush.
Yeah. So it's interesting that history is not.
That's representative of the banking system.
Yeah.
If you don't have a banking system, you can't fund a war. If you have a war, they're supplying both sides by default.
Yeah.
I think William Conqueror was funded by banks in affecting history. I don't know how.
Who's that?
William the Conqueror.
Oh, yeah.
Went broke, but the banks were loaning him money, and then he owed big time.
Did they have banks in those days?
And the multinational food companies that are poisoning the world joyously.
You can't make solar roofs mandatory because they're too busy making vaccines mandatory. That's a big lobbying effort. It takes a lot of man and women power to do such a thing. Solar is so far down the road, mandating solar. But in Germany, to give you an example, I spent July of last summer in Cannes. Not once did it rain in the entire month of July. My girlfriend was near Frankfurt, where my ancestors came from. Her mother's garden was so muddy they couldn't even walk in it. It rained out of those 30 days, 26 days. And still Germany per capita or per square mile has the most solar. I think it's per capita in the world. Yeah.
And the Danes aren't far behind, actually. The Danes are close. And you're right, Brazil is, I think, energy independent, they say. I don't know if I trust that. Of course, they're mowing down the forest to plant.
Well, I should have included Denmark with wind. Denmark would be
Well, first, there will be 50% renewable by 2025, and they just passed a thing in their parliament to be 100% renewable by 2050. So, which they can do with, it just takes work. It just takes, of course, you know, it takes affluence, and it takes, I mean, the population's 6 million, so they have a different problem than we do. But integrating large volumes of renewables onto a grid and keeping everything running takes some work, but you know, it can be done.
Well, by the way, off the coast here, if you look at Point Conception, I think it's, in that area, they've done, I guess, the studies. I was just talking to a friend of mine that used to be the head scientist for wind. He was telling me that we have one of the spots in the world that is really, really, I guess, an excellent site for offshore wind. If that could happen here, it'd be nice.
Could happen in 10 years.
They could, huh?
The solar you're talking about,
Yeah.
onshore and offshore wind could happen in 10 years if there was the political will.
Yeah.
I guess I have such a bad sense of all this, just given that what I understand is we're wasting or just blowing into the wind 50% of what is used in terms of fuel energy. That's a number I heard tossed about for, I don't know if that's real, valid or not, but if that is accurate, that we waste up to 50% of the fuel that's used in this country in various ways. Wasted is a pretty broad term.
Yes.
But if that's the case, then a lot of these conversations are just, it's like, well, it's not that we need more or even to change what we have near as much as we need to stop wasting.
for sure.
I mean, look at Las Vegas. I go to Las Vegas, I almost have a heart attack.
Yes.
I go to Montecito and I almost have a heart attack. I was in Aspen and full houses that are completely unoccupied 95% of the time, fully lit,
Yeah.
and they're monstrosities. They look like hotels. They're
Yeah.
single-family residences with no occupant because they live in New York City. They don't live in these houses.
Right.
And they're allowed to keep them fully on. There's no rules. There's no laws. There's no repercussions, and they have the money to just blow it off and send a message that that's okay. And I don't know, I guess I have such a hard time with just the fact that we're just wasting so much. I almost can't even get to the next step is that we need to change all these fuels. We need to stop wasting.
Yes.
And no one really, there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort to stop the waste.
It's definitely.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's concerted, but I would say, I mean, it goes back to this kind of sociologic thing, this transition that I believe our civilization is making over a period of time. I'm not happy about the progress we're making on this either. But it does seem to me that there's growing rancor about waste of the type that you're talking about. I think that more people are catching on. You know, I walked through my little town, San Ynez, on the other side of the mountain the other day, and I walked into a store and there's a woman there with a car running. I walked out of the store, the car's still running, and I go, "Do you know that your car's running?" She goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, do you know that if you turned off the car, you'd be saving gasoline and you'd be making the planet a cleaner place in which to live?" You know, good thing, you know, she wasn't armed or she could have shot me. She wasn't happy to hear that. But there are people, I'm not the only one walking around saying, this is, how do you wouldn't dump garbage in somebody's front yard. What type of human being are you?
Well, remember the days when we used to dump garbage in people's yards, where there's litter everywhere?
Yes.
And somehow we got through that.
Yes.
We changed it.
Not a bad analogy.
It took a long time.
Not a bad analogy. Good.
A lot of TV commercials.
Yes, please.
I think, first of all, I'm Sunil Joe Laker. I own a solar energy startup. We discovered a way to essentially print solar panels and cells and make them really cheap and in the US. But that's a little bit down the road. We're still in our early stage. But my question was money. If you're looking at things that are not sustainable, I think one of the first things to come up is our debt-based growth is imperative money supply. Now, how do you suggest that you change that so that the world will be okay if, say, there's years where we don't increase the energy supply or increase the amount of trees we're cutting down or aquifers we're depleting.
Right.
For GDP.
Well, it's interesting. Part of my focus.
Lord knows I'm not an expert in this, but I need to become closer to one, and that is how are electric utilities regulated? How do they make money? And it's a very Byzantine thing, especially in California. There's certain states in the union where you can read this and you go, I wouldn't have done it that way, but I can understand it. Here, forget it. It takes years to understand the way this works here. But my point is, it needs to be eradicated. It needs to be pulled out by the roots and replaced with something that gives them the same incentive that you're talking about. In other words, we don't want you making more money by ruining our planet. Okay? So we want to, if you want to make money, I don't have a problem with that, but I do want it to be associated with clean energy and using less of it. So I don't know exactly how to do that, but I do think that a lot of these, a lot of what you see around you is completely is unattuned to the sensibilities of what we're talking of sustainability. They don't care. It makes money by poisoning the world. And I know there are people, I mean, you've talked about agribusiness and Monsanto and so forth and so on. I know there are people in this room who, you know, agree with me.
You asked my question, but the way I hear the question is, the broader question is not just the renewable, but what do we do when the economic, I don't know, analysts or whoever they are tell us we're going to have a recession and then a worldwide depression and the economies of all the countries in the world are going to fall apart and there'll be starvation and this and that. That's what puzzles me, like what do we do to not have worldwide depression and save our energy?
Great. Well, I suppose if you're concerned about that, I guess everybody's concerned.
So it seems to me that, remember where I was talking about plans A, B, and C? There are a lot of people. I'll send you something if you give me your, just go to my website and hit contact. I'll respond with something. An interview, or a set of interviews with people who have me convinced. Amory Lovins, you know, Jeremy Rifkin, some real household names in this whole thing, lay out enormously detailed treatises on how we do need to grow our way out of this thing and how we can. The concept of the third industrial revolution built around clean tech. So I'm not, there are people who know more about this who say that won't work, but it's credible to me, and there are a lot of people buying into this. Europe is doing this in a very big way. Europe, when you think about the commerce, the industry, what is happening, obviously there are debt crisis issues, but they really are investing an awful lot in this to build their way out of this. Yes.
I'd like to comment, sorry.
Like, I think that growth is a good thing, especially right now. Like, we need to transition to renewable energies. Some industrialists, hopefully including, become very rich. And then, like, 50 years down the road, everything will run on solar, wind, or whatever else. But then what? The economy requires constant growth, otherwise the currency base collapses. So we really need to focus on solving that problem at the same time.
I'd like to answer that question. Just as we are shifting from old energy to new energy, coal to solar or whatever, nuclear to geothermal, whatever, the money will shift in that direction as well, because it's going to become immensely profitable for people to back, not just to manufacture, but also back new energy. And by new energy, I mean renewables, and then water, and, you know, all these other things, non-GMO foods and whatever. It's going to become immensely profitable. So the money will shift, and there will always be money that will be generated to back that, both money generated from actually creating the energy and from the backers. And we have to get this whole, because, you know, without the financial backers, we can't really make anything right now. To do the first shift, to start making solar panels or to start building wind turbines, we need this enormous backing. So once they realize that, yes, this is immensely profitable and it's going to continue to grow, they're all gonna shift over. So that's how whole economic shift will happen automatically, is my opinion.
No, but that's not my question. My question was on the debt-based financial model,
Yeah.
which requires constant growth year after year after year.
Or inflation.
Or
Yeah,
inflation, but what do you change to so that, because you don't want to grow forever, let's be honest. Eventually we'll fill up the universe and then that won't be a whole lot of fun. We need to find this like middle ground where we can coast along and still be all right. We'll still travel the world, invent new electronic devices, things like that, but we won't be adding like 100, 200 million people each year. We won't be like using more and more and more energy, and the money supply is kind of based on that infinite assumption. So how would you suggest that we change that?
I think there actually has been a major shift, and nobody talks about it, except the Economist about 8 months, 9 months ago, a survey on demographics, what's happening in the world. They were saying it's the undeclared, undisclosed, huge benefit that's happening in the world. It's no longer true that developing countries are increasing at 3+%, birth rates. They're evolving at rates that are very similar to our own. Very, very conservative. And that's happened independent of anything else that's happened except some general economic growth, and you could call it globalization. So I think it's a huge advantage that we don't talk about.
It's really a huge shift time of world history that we've never been at before. We've never been at this spot before where we are talking about consciously developing the systems that we're going to live by. History, it evolved to the systems. Like the steam engine evolved because they were choking on their own coal, so they evolved. But right now, we're just starting to question, how is it all going to work? And we have to design how it's all going to work. And it's really exciting, but we're behind the curve. And there's also another thing happening that economically, because we have so much more manufacturing and more efficient,